Welcome to the Faithful and True podcast. We have something a little different, a little special for you today. We'd like to take you back and we'd like to feature a legacy podcast that features Dr. Mark Laaser and Debbie Laaser. And we're addressing the topic of
trusting yourself. One of the things I've heard the women here at Faithful and True talk about is this idea that they want to encourage spouses to learn how to trust themselves, because there's been so many of them that have had promptings, have had awarenesses, and they really didn't trust that. So the first step in this journey is learning to trust yourself. And in that is also trusting God. And so we basically have two podcasts. The first one's going to be about trusting yourself, and the second one's going to be about trusting God.
Today we have a very special guest, to me for obvious reasons, my wife Debbie, and we've been kind of hinting at this, but the last two shows we did were about how a husband can rebuild trust, and so now today we're going to move on to some of the things a wife can be thinking about for herself, and so Debbie's here with us today. So welcome.
Thanks for inviting me.
Welcome, Debbie. Yeah,
Thank you very much. I always like being with you men, talking about various things.
Well, we've been getting emails and eagerly anticipating your appearance, so we're happy to have you with us today.
And a special hello to all of those who are gathered together tonight or today or whenever it is to listen to this together. I think that's a great idea, by the way. All right. Today we're going to talk about what you can do to learn to trust yourself, right?
Yes. Well, I guess my understanding is you all talked your last session about what some of the men can do to start rebuilding trust with their wives.
That is right, yeah.
And, of course, as wives, we know these things are really, really important, because when our trust has been broken, it's really important to see someone who's working on rebuilding that. But what I'm also knowing through the years of my own work and working with so many women is that our trust that we're going to develop now, hopefully in our recovery program, is going to look different than what it was a long time ago, which was more of an implicit kind of trust. I think most of us agree that when we fell in love with all of you spouses, we just trusted you, and we didn't even think too much about it. And
it's kind of a blind trust.
It was a blind trust for sure, and I think it's what we knew to do back then, maybe when we first met, and this time we're going to learn how to trust differently. And so you have talked through how a husband can work on his part of that, but what I also know is there's a really important part for her to work on in terms of what I call trusting herself. So that's what we're going to focus on today. And I would also like to come back at some point and do another session with you to talk about what it means to trust God in this process too, because that, of course, is the ultimate way we're going to learn how to trust, so very, very important.
Yeah, that's right. So, well, you just want to get right into it, because I know there are 8 points. We did 14 points of what the husband can do. That took 2 shows, and now we're going to get on to this part, which is, I think, 8 different points.
Sure. Well, I have created 8 points. I'm sure if we sat down and thought about it, there could be many more than this, but these are certainly some that have come to my mind. And yeah, maybe we'll start at what I know is pretty true when I meet with wives, and we begin to talk about the story of discovery of when trust was broken, that for most of them, they have had intuitive thoughts, they've had red flags come up in life about something, they've had gut feelings about behaviors or things that they were told, and for most of us, we tended to ignore those, or we talked ourselves out of them somehow or another. And I think one of the things that I'm encouraging women to think about as they learn to trust themselves is that these intuitions or red flags or gut feelings, whatever we want to call them, I've come to really believe are of the Holy Spirit. And these are not just some random things that pass by, but I really think it is how God is speaking to us from within. And one of the ways that we will grow in trusting ourselves is trusting that soft whisper that comes inside of us sometimes and wants to tell us something about our world that's not matching up for us. So what I know in order to develop this ability to listen is it often takes slowing down in our life. And this is what I think gets really tough for most of us because we're all moving through life at such a rapid speed. We've got lots of things to do. Our life is full of responsibilities, work, children, whatever. And so maybe the pain of this betrayal is going to serve us in some good ways, one of which is pain generally slows us down. And if we can use the slowing down as a way to try to connect more so with these soft whispers inside of us, I think that's one of the first great steps to starting to trust ourselves.
Okay, so slowing down, practically, what might that look like?
Well, I think for many women, it's about eliminating some of the things that they're spending time at. I can remember for myself, meals got much simpler. I guess we ordered in, ate out. We joke about how waffles and whatever,
Peanut
cereal
butter,
and
yeah.
waffles and peanut butter, cereal and bananas. I'm not
Yeah,
saying
but
we do that
for
all
Thanksgiving
the time.
dinner, I think it's a little much. But
You're right. But learning how to do things simpler, not caring so much about all the hours perhaps in cleaning a house or deciding to cut back on work hours for a time, taking a leave of absence perhaps. I know for me is just building in sometimes to be quiet and to be reflective, which are not my general pace. And I find that's true for most of us women. We move at a pretty rapid pace.
Yeah, I remember at one point our mutual therapist kind of forced you to take a weekend.
That's right. And, we were almost 15 years into marriage. I had never taken any kind of day or two by myself away just for me.
Right.
That was the beginning of experiencing what it meant to slow down and not be consumed with all of life's responsibilities.
Yeah. Well, I think it's a hard one because I think a lot of us are, whether we're workaholics or not, we like to be busy, and so this has to be very intentional, right?
Well, I think it's in some ways kind of supernatural. Generally when we're in pain, our tendency is going to want to be to speed up and figure out problems and solutions. And if anything, we probably work faster, we work harder. So to talk about building trust in ourselves that may come from actually slowing down and being a listener of what God wants to say to us is very supernatural.
Yeah, and perhaps unfamiliar, at least historically.
Right.
So number one is, I need to learn to slow down and listen to the Holy Spirit. Number two, you might as well say it. I could say it, but...
Yeah, number 2 on my list was just acknowledging my own feelings and learning what they're telling me about needs, thoughts I have, desires, and decisions I'm going to make. I think for many of us, we haven't thought a whole lot about really paying attention to what I'm feeling. And by that I mean being able to name feelings with feeling words other than good and fine.
Yeah.
I know we joke about that around here at our center, but we start all of our sessions with getting people to practice what they're feeling and being able to use emotional words to describe feelings. And I suppose some would say, well, why do you spend so much time doing that? But I really believe that our feelings are great messengers to us about things we are needing
Right.
and decisions perhaps we're needing to make. And so if we can listen to our feelings again, sometimes that takes the slowing down process to really pay attention to what we're feeling. What I know is true is that it will lead us to eventually figure out what we need. So, for instance, this morning I was working with someone and she had a great need because her husband had just slipped. For him, as she took some time to think about it, for him to work on the why that happened for him. And she didn't particularly want to just put out there some kind of punishment for him or make him leave the house. But as she slowed down and really thought about it, and we talked through several scenarios, what she began to connect to was that she really needed, out of her fear that this could happen again, more of a deeper exploration on his part to figure out what had caused this slip. So I thought that was a great example of, again, she paid attention to her feelings. Her feelings were fear. Her feelings were anger and frustration, and they led her to a need she had of needing more information, of understanding
Right.
from him.
Right.
Another thing that I think is very important in terms of trusting ourselves is knowing about the truth of who I am based on how God defines me. You know, that I know without a doubt that I am a worthy human being, that I have value. I think one of the things that happens for many of us is that we allow others to define us and our worthiness, especially our spouses. And I think one of the things that gets so shattered for most wives is when there's discovery of infidelity in the relationship. We also begin to just slide right off of maybe what was true for us, or maybe we've always struggled with that truth, to believe things like I'll never be enough, or I'm not enough, or if I were worthy enough, this would never have happened.
Right.
And so I believe in trusting ourselves. We need to do a great amount of work to get back to a foundation of what is really true in God's eyes about who we are. I find in working with women, every once in a while I do a little survey in my therapy groups, and I ask, how many of you are still struggling with the truth about who you are and trusting that you're a valuable and worthy human being? And sadly, it's 100% response every time I ask that question. And I know that for most of us, it's a work in progress. And so I think as we begin to trust ourselves, our behaviors will come and they'll flow from some basic beliefs we have about ourselves. So if we're not grounded in that truth, it sets us up for all kinds of coping and needing to trust other things other than this truth.
Sure. Okay. Number 4.
Number 4, in terms of trusting ourselves, I think, is being able to assess where I am with my own fears and anxieties. What's true, I think, for some women is this has been an issue for them for a long, long time, way before even being married or knowing about discovery of sex addiction in their marriage. Hoping to depend on someone else being healthy enough or sober enough so that my fears and anxieties will totally go away, I find is not realistic, and also, again, allows our fears and anxieties to be controlled by someone else's behaviors. So I always say that it's really important to assess for that and to figure out what I need to do to take care of myself, to manage my anxieties. I had a wife I was talking to out of state last week, and I know she was sharing a story with me that her husband had learned how to speak in certain ways and not respond to her in certain ways so her anxiety would not get ramped up. And she really appreciated that. And while I said that was very nice of him to be working on that, and being a safe communicator is going to be important for both of us, I had hoped that she would also be able to learn ways to manage her own anxiety so that she wasn't always dependent on him having to say things just in the right way so she wouldn't get ramped up. For some women, that means on the front end getting some help with medication even. It might be some naturopathic ways of learning biofeedback or yoga even, or exercises, breathing exercises. It may be also knowing what to do with anxiety, how to reach out with calls, journal, pray, take reflective time.
Spiritual meditation.
Spiritual meditations, exactly. But whatever it is, there are numerous ways that we can work on how our anxiety revs inside of us. And again, what needs we may have to eliminate some of that or manage it for ourselves when it seems like it's getting out of control.
Well, it's really a marriage issue too, because when I'm working with the men, if they're trying to manage their wives' anxieties, that really puts them firmly in the camp of being a codependent. And don't get me wrong, I want the husband serving the wife, but not doing things simply for the motivation of trying to manage her anxiety.
And when you think about it, if that's what he's trying to do, he also can't be fully honest with her.
Right.
And interestingly enough, that's what she's longing for.
Right.
So we sabotage the very thing we want when we want a partner to be honest, if in fact we're also expecting them to manage our emotions for us. We can't have both.
So it's a collaborative effort. And I think both of us, husband and wife, needs to be working on anxiety, really. So
We find that to be true, don't we?
Yeah.
More so than so many things that we have that in common. In some ways, we all deal with anxiety. Some of us much greater than others.
Yeah.
And for many of us, that goes way back before even we met each other. So
Right.
figuring out how we do that so we're not expecting, again, trusting that someone else will live their life in such a way that I don't have to feel anxious is not a way of building trust for yourself.
And it's not realistic. So,
Right.
well, any of these points we could talk about a long time.
Could.
But I think for the purposes of today's show, let's move on to number 5.
Well, I think one of the big ways we build trust for ourselves is working on and committing to be a whole person. Just ourselves, in and of ourselves, knowing we could be a standalone person and be okay. When we live life from that place and we really take a look at what our fears are about being alone, and they can be so many different things for wives, when we work on that list of fears, or we have an opportunity to be alone for a time and know that we actually will be okay. It may not be how we would choose to live the rest of our life, but we know from that place that we can trust that life can be okay if we're alone. Then it allows us to make decisions about our relationship from a healthier place, not a need-based place, not a desperate place, but a choosing place. It can be one of, I choose to be with you, I don't have to be with you. And that's a great place for a woman to be able to live.
Right. It's like I don't need you, but I do want to be with you.
You know, I'm not sure if we should bring this up now, but I guess I will since I started it. You know,
We run into that all the
I
time.
know.
One of us says something, go, well, we're going
I
in this
guess we're
direction. Here we go.
well, I know for many of our couples, there is a period of redemptive separation that happens in terms of their healing journey. And I think one of the great things that can come out of redemptive separation is this truth and trust in oneself that, you know, while I never thought I could be okay alone, after a period of time of being alone in redemptive separation, we can land more in that truth of, yes, it was hard, and I know now that I can be okay.
I can be alone and okay. Yeah. That, I would say, by the way, is one of the hardest things spiritually and emotionally to get to. All right, number 6.
Well, I think one of the ways we build trust in ourselves is knowing that we don't have to do it alone.
Right.
And that we have the ability to build community, safe community, where we can identify our needs, we can ask for help, so that we're dependent not just on our husband for everything in our life, which I think often happens in our relationships. We get overly dependent on each other, such that we don't have options, it seems, if our husband can't be there for us or can't help us with something, or can't serve us with a desire of our heart, then we just feel stuck. But trusting ourselves, I think, is growing that community of where else can we get legitimate needs and desires met in healthy ways.
Right.
And that takes practice, too, because for most of us, we haven't worked on that very much.
Well, we're huge believers in community here, and we understand sometimes that there's frustration out there in trying to find that safe community. But we also know that God has a plan, and if you're open to sharing your own story, I think you're always going to build community. All right, number 7.
Number 7 is about actually building trust in yourself by knowing you are a trustworthy person. This is kind of a different concept maybe when we've been betrayed and we get all focused on the other person having to build trust. But I work a lot with women on whether they're being a trustworthy person, because trust does go both ways. And by that, we work on specific things which I like to call walking the high road, no matter what the circumstances. And I often believe that there's no greater time to practice walking the high road than when we're in a lot of pain. Most of us can walk the high road when life's just moving along and nothing tragic is happening or crisis-oriented. But what do we do when we're in a lot of pain and life hasn't been fair, or some of those places? Can we make decisions to be a trustworthy person and to walk the high road, to do what we say we're going to do, to make the right choice, even though it's a hard one. And that's what I'm helping women do all the time, so that they can trust themselves about being the person God calls them to be, no matter what the situation is.
I think with so many of these points, I think there's a related point with the husbands in terms of, in other words, they need to learn to trust themselves. I mean, all of these points that apply to the wives, I think, also apply to the husbands.
Oh, I would say so.
Yeah.
Definitely. In trusting ourselves, I think we owe it to ourselves to examine what it has been like to be a trustworthy, to be a person who can trust others.
Right.
And for many women, what is true is history, family of origin, or in schools and churches or whatever, their trust has been broken already many times by
Right.
significant people in their life.
Right.
And what I've come to know is that if we don't do some of that old exploration in looking at how that happened and in working through the pain of that, I believe we'll carry those memories with us. We'll carry the PTSD that comes with that with us. We'll carry the messages about ourselves with us. And it will make it a lot more difficult to trust today. Well, I was working with a woman who was from South America, and she was sharing with me that in their culture, it was not uncommon at all for women to be sexually abused by brothers, fathers, grandfathers, pastors. And in fact, she shared with me in her story, she had 4 brothers, and she had been sexually abused by all of them as well as her father. So when we began talking about trusting her husband now, who was in a program of recovery, she turned to me, and it was like she had this big aha for herself, and she said, you know, I've been abused by every significant man in my life. And my belief today is no man is trustworthy. So I can see that my husband hardly has any chance at all to earn my trust unless I go after figuring this out for myself. And I said, you know, that's a beautiful awareness on your part, and I think it's absolutely true. That of course you wouldn't. Of course you would have difficulty trusting. And let's go after some of that old pain and see if we can reframe some of what's happening today in your life, so that maybe with your husband working on his trustworthiness, you might be able to change the direction that's happened in your life.
I think that's very profound, that there's no men in her life historically that have been trustworthy. But maybe the first one will be her husband,
Yeah.
actually.
Well, it would be wonderful to see
Yeah,
that could be the
exactly right.
case.
Welcome back. We hope you enjoyed the first part of this 2-part podcast about trusting yourself, and now part 2 about trusting God.
Today we're going to continue with Debbie, my wife, and last time we were talking about things a wife can do to learn how to trust herself, and today in part 2 we're going to talk about how a wife can also move on and, very importantly, learn how to trust God. So thanks for being back. Thanks for
welcome
being
back
here.
to the show, Debbie.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so we don't need to summarize the last one, I think, but just moving right into this one, you have 10 points, so number 1.
Well, let me just summarize what I'm going to say today by saying that I think one of the things I notice for a wife's journey through something as painful as sex addiction, betrayal, is that first and foremost, I think she finds that it's a journey of growing deeper in her faith and dependence on God. So in some ways, when we talk about building trust, we probably could have reversed all of these, and we could have started with trusting God, then trusting self, and then looking to how a spouse could be more trustworthy for you.
Right.
So I want to just make sure
Yeah.
we get the order right, even though our
So you're saying putting God first really has its benefits.
Yes, it does. It does. And it's not always the easier thing to do when you're in pain.
Right.
I think our tendency is to want to try to control and to see, you know, what all we can do to change things and look to another person. And they're all important. I'm not saying that. But first and foremost in trusting God, you know, I wrote here that we want to learn that we need to surrender our spouse's life to the Lord for his protection and care, for his knowing that I can't control him, nor can others. And truly, you know, his decision to get well is going to be one that's between he and the Lord. And so surrendering that, knowing that it's not about what I can do to be a better person, a better wife, to be more sexual, to be more fun, to be more intelligent is really not going to be the solution to this problem.
This is kind of like Al-Anon's first step a little bit, don't you think? Or maybe I'm overreaching there, but I think Al-Anon's first step, I admitted I was powerless over the alcoholic. And this one would be I'm powerless over the addict, really.
Yeah, that would be true.
Right. Okay.
The second point in terms of trusting God, I think, is really developing a belief that I can surrender my life to Him too. And by that I mean, all of it, the needs I'm going to have, the money that it's going to take to get into a good program, what we're going to tell everybody, how in the world I'm going to manage, the label of this in my life. I mean, there are so many things we worry about and we seek to have answers about, and we worry how in the world we're going to find the resources, the time, the energy, whatever, to manage this kind of recovery. And I think, in essence, we're learning to surrender that and just trust that God provides. And the stories I hear are so heartwarming. I could write a book about the stories of how God has provided for women in so many different ways when they certainly felt out of options for themselves. Right. And this is where I think our dependence on the Lord grows, when we've tried and tried and tried so many different things that haven't worked, and we do finally surrender.
Right.
Number 3 is really about trusting God's timing. I find this is a really interesting one, especially because, again, as humans, I think we want things to speed along.
Right.
I know I had one woman come in, she was 8 months pregnant. Her husband was due to get transferred in a month to a new location. And what she was hoping on this first visit with me is that within these 4 weeks, we could kind of wrap this sex addiction issue up. And I said to her as gently as I could, my experience is it's really going to take quite a bit longer than that. And what I have learned is that oftentimes God's timing is even way longer than what we experience sometimes in being able to help people here. And I've also learned that God's timing is always perfect. I can't always explain why things happen when they do, but I know He has this ability to orchestrate just the right experiences at the right time, such that we learn what we need to learn in that moment, and He allows us to move along in the next step of our program.
Yeah, I think that this has always been one of the hardest for me, I know. I think a lot of the addicts wonder, why did it take so long to get the help that they needed? But now as I look back on it 30 years ago, you can see the elements of all the things that God had to get in place before I was willing to get the help that I needed. So,
from a marketing standpoint, if you can come up with that 4-week program,
you love it, huh, Randy?
I think we could sell a lot of that. That's just one of those quick fix deals.
I used to think, if we could just figure it out faster and whatever, it would be so great. But what I know is, God needs us to experience certain things before we can move on to the next thing, and it just isn't going to happen.
As usual, I was kidding.
Yeah. We know you were, but on the other hand, I think there is a large percentage of the Christian community who would like to go to a weekend seminar
and come home fixed.
Come home fixed.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. All right, we are kind of moving along faster. Speaking of fast, but the show has its own timing too.
I know.
Number 4.
Number 4 is I'm beginning to trust in God that when I struggle with not having the information I need, that I will trust Him to provide that for me in some way. And I find this is amazing too, the stories I hear, because while it's true we can be detectives if we're sensing things aren't matching up, or we're just fairly sure something's wrong and we don't know what in the world it is, and we've tried numerous ways to try to ask the questions we would like the answers to. Sometimes it just gets to be time to surrender all of that and to simply pray to God, if there's something more you need me to know about my relationship or my husband's behavior, I just trust that you will let me know in some shape or form what that is. And the stories that I hear that follow that kind of surrender are amazing. Women that knew nothing about computers and all of a sudden they realize they're in on their husband's accounts reading emails from someone, or they've been led to a certain place where they've detected some information, or a printout came on their computer printer when they hadn't even selected anything and it was information. But I have to believe that God is part of this. It's too superhuman for some of the women to be able to do some of the things that allowed them to get the information
Right.
they needed. So
Right.
trusting that God will get it to you if he needs it to you.
Well, it's kind of one of those things too, where be careful what you pray for, because you may be getting information that could be painful also. So, all right, number 5.
Number 5 is a little bit of a recap of what I said last time, is just shifting that blind trust that we gave to our spouses and shifting it instead to God, the only person who is totally trustworthy here. And knowing that we can ask for certain things to build trust in human beings, but really we all fall short. And there's no human being that can give us all that we need to totally and forever guarantee trust in who they are. And just, I think, living in the truth of that
Right.
is healthy.
Yeah, exactly. All right, number 6 we're on.
Number 6,
Yeah.
I'm learning to trust that God will never abandon me, because I think that's a fear most of us have at some point, that
Right.
we will be all alone and no one will be there. And I think sometimes when we're crying out in our pain and we're praying for his intervention in our life, and it doesn't seem like we're hearing anything, and we start to question whether he's there at all, or many of us question, how in the world could you allow these things to happen to me? If you're really there, why is it that you're allowing these things to happen to me?
Right.
I think really growing our trust in God, that he is in there, he has been there, he will be there, he will never abandon us, is something that we learn to really trust over time.
All right, number 7.
I want to also continue to trust that God loves me. We spoke about that a little bit in our last session also, in terms of trusting ourselves, but really, really believing and living at the core of who we are, that we are a precious one to him, that he wants to prosper me, and that he has filled me with passion and purpose, and really trusting him enough that he didn't make a mistake
Right.
in who I am. I often connect to this one mostly by thinking about myself as a parent to my own children. And I think about how it is sad for me whenever they don't think they are enough. Because when I look at them and I think about having birthed them and brought them into this world, and they're so, so special, that I can't imagine, and it just sickens my heart to think that they aren't living in the love that I would have for them. And I think about God being like that with me. And it helps me to grow this place in me, to stop questioning sometimes these places inside of myself, and just trust that he didn't make a mistake.
Right. All these things are matters of ongoing spiritual discipline and spending time with the Lord, I think. All right, number 8.
Number 8 is really trusting that God will meet all the desires of my heart. You and I have written a book called The 7 Desires. We believe those desires are at the heart of all men and women, the desire to be heard and understood, and the desire to be affirmed and to be blessed or loved unconditionally, the desire to be safe, the desire to be touched in healthy ways, to feel chosen and to be included.
Right.
I think one of the things that we've often looked to is our spouses to serve us with all those desires of our heart. And what we've come to know is that's impossible for any one person to be able to serve us with all the desires of our heart. And in fact, I don't think God was making a mistake when he didn't allow us to be able to do that, because if you could be that perfect person for me or I for you, I don't know that we would even need our faith journey anymore. We wouldn't need a God to be in our life
That's right.
to show us how to serve us with our desires. So I think when we come to trust God, it's that in some ways when those aren't met in our significant relationships, we know that we can turn to him and we can call out, I'm in desperate need today of someone affirming something about me. Would you just know my heart's aching for that? Or I long for some way to feel safe, and to know that God, either through others or in ways we can't even imagine, ends up serving us with those desires of our heart.
Right. Okay, we're kind of zipping through these, but number 9.
Number 9 is, I think, that we're trusting God that there is a next right step for ourselves. I know we're constantly told that it's not our job to figure out our future and to control that. And I think we're also led to believe that he does give us a Holy Spirit. He does give us a counselor of sorts that lives within us, that will help direct our next steps. And I think if it's one thing I work on continually with wives is figuring out what just the next right step is. Not the one that's 5 steps down the road, 1 week down the road, 5 years down the road, but just the next one. And I find it amazing how, God is so much a part of, again, if we listen to those soft whispers inside of us and we pay attention to our emotions, which lead us to our needs, which often lead us to our next steps, that God is incredibly in that. What I've consistently found is trusting that when we take the next right step, that God is laying out the next one after that, and then the next one. And so sometimes we can get really confused when we're making really difficult decisions. And if we can pull it back just to one next one and trust that God's in that, it makes the process a lot easier.
Right. Okay, the next right point, which is number 10.
This brings us to the grand finale. If I had a drum roll, I would play it right now.
Okay.
Number 10.
Well, I love number 10 because it's probably the hardest one to hear in the beginning of crisis in our life or great adversity from something like sexual addiction, but it's trusting that God will not waste our pain. And the truth is we are in a lot of pain, all of us, you men, wives, we're in a lot of pain from the discovery of sex addiction. And when we can trust that God will not waste our pain, that He will use our pain to strengthen us personally, He will grow our relationships to make those richer, that He will deepen our faith journey. And it's been proven time and time again in Scripture. We're reminded of that also, to rejoice in our trials because they will be used to grow us up and not leave us with anything incomplete in our lives. And I know that to be such a truth, so much so that I've been doing research on it. Clinically, we call that post-traumatic growth, and spiritually, we call it sanctification.
Yeah.
And it's a beautiful thing when our clinical worlds mesh with biblical worlds, as we hope ours does all the time. But what I know is my favorite place when I'm working with women is when further enough down the road they can say to me, I know this sounds kind of weird, but I'm actually kind of thankful for this journey because I know I wouldn't be who I am today had I not walked through this recovery process with my husband.
One last question about that, because I know a lot of the listeners might be wondering this. I get asked it all the time, as I know you do. How long do you think something like this takes? We were talking earlier about the fact that it's not 4 sessions, it's not 4 weeks, it's not 4 months, but...
Well, I'm glad you asked, actually, because I recently finished a research project with several hundred women.
Right.
And this is one of the things we were looking for. Is there growth after crisis in your life? When you've been traumatized by something, is it possible to grow?
Yeah.
And I was not surprised because I was expecting and was very glad to see that the results validated that, yes, in fact, there is. And with those over 200 women that were part of my survey, and certainly my own life would validate that as well, that given the right resources and enough time to work a process of recovery in community with counseling and truth, there is all the reason in the world that you will end up with growth in your life. The timing of that seemed to be for wives at around the period of 18 months to 2 years.
Okay.
So it's not to say that we don't experience some good things before that, but I think to get to that place where we can accept that distress in our lives, stress and distress, coincided with growth. They both existed together. And that's what we would call post-traumatic growth or sanctification, becoming the best version of ourselves, the person that God called us to be.
So we hope that these 2 podcasts together have really been just a kind of an invitation to begin to explore trust, because what we know is in many situations, trust has been significantly broken and violated, and so it begins with trust again. So thanks for being with us.
We trust that these 2 podcasts have been meaningful and beneficial to you. So until we meet with you again, we hope that this coming week will be a week for you that's filled with many blessings and with great vision.